Today we're going to talk about journalism, politics, and earthquakes. But before we do that, let me tell you that my entire presentation is totally bilingual because I want my findings to be shown in my mother tongue. So having said that, this is part of my doctoral dissertation. In this particular piece, I observed how political reporters from 3 news websites in Chile covered an earthquake that occurred in northern Chile in 2014. Here? To the back. Oh, yeah. Sorry, he's giving me instructions. So, yeah. Okay, so just to give you some context, in 2006, we elected our first female president, Michelle Bachelet, and she was very popular, and by the time that she was finishing her first presidential term, there was this massive 8.8 magnitude earthquake that hit the south, and then the subsequent tsunami, and she was highly criticized by both the media and the public because of their management of the crisis. They did a terrible job at informing the people how the crisis unfolded, and they failed to set the tsunami alert on time. So because of that, more than 100 people died by drowning during the tsunami. She left office, and then we elected Sebastián Piñera. He had to deal with the reconstruction and all the consequences of the earthquake. And when he left, we re-elected Michelle Bachelet. And 3 weeks after she took office, another massive earthquake, 8.2 magnitude, and subsequent tsunami hit the country, this time in the north. So this time around, they did a great job. They managed the situation in a very competent way. They set a tsunami alert on time. They evacuated people in the coast. And yet, they didn't get very nice coverage. So I decided to observe this. It was a very interesting setup, the same government, almost the same team, almost the same disaster, but 2 totally different approaches when managing the situation. So I was wondering, how did the Chilean news media cover this earthquake? And I observed 3 news websites, La Tercera, El Mercurio, and La Nación, and I downloaded all the stories that they published a month after the earthquake, around 400 stories. What I was expecting to find was what previous research had found. So what we know about this, earthquakes are considered event-driven news as opposed to institutionally driven news. And they are reported as a series of unrelated events. So instead of connecting what is going on with previous disasters, sometimes journalists do it and use previous disasters as benchmarks, but they usually inform about what's going on right now because people need to know those things right away. So we also know that they are covered from an episodic instead of a thematic approach, which means that the idea is to inform the day-by-day situation, but not necessarily to locate the event into a larger context, a larger picture that eventually might impact how they do public policy about disaster management. And unofficial sources are more likely to be considered because the most important angle that they usually use for this is human interest. So you get to see people who lost their houses or got damaged because of the situation, and that's why they get a little bit more coverage in this kind of a particular crisis. Yet, what I found after analyzing my 400 stories is that there was an intense flow of institutionally driven information because the government was also trying to push their frames to the attention of the journalists. But at the same time, the media portrayed the successful management as the lessons learned from the disaster in 2010. And what they also did was to have a very thematic approach, because they were trying to give explanations, but basically what they wanted was for people not to forget what happened 4 years ago. So they said that most of the stories said, okay, yeah, they are doing a great job now, but let's not forget what happened 4 years ago. And finally, unofficial sources were irrelevant because the main angle of the coverage wasn't the human interest coverage, it was the political angle. So we found in this situation that a natural disaster is portrayed as a political issue. And I tried to understand what's going on here, what happened, right? And I wasn't able to answer this question just based on the content analysis of my stories, and I decided to ask journalists themselves how they did this, like how did they determine the male angle of the coverage, and I wanted to know also how was the relationship that they had with official sources and also unofficial sources. So I contacted around 15 political reporters who wrote the stories that I was analyzing, and I was able to get 7 of them to agree to have a phone interview with me and talk about these issues. So I had 3 journalists from La Tercera, 2 journalists from El Mercurio, and 2 journalists from La Nación. And I asked them, like, how you determine the main angle? And they told me literally it was editorial prompting. My editor told me so. And they also mentioned that, well, it was seen, the previous earthquake, it was seen as Bachelet's biggest problem. And since there was another earthquake when just starting the second term, we had to see how they could act. So we didn't really pay attention to the earthquake itself. We went to the north, but not to cover the disaster, to cover her, to cover Bachelet. And I have a quote here. La Tercera has made its goal to expose President Bachelet. We did a lot of comparative analysis during the 2014 disaster, but behind such analysis was the intention of exposing the president. The paper likes seeing Bachelet weak. So this is a quote from a journalist from La Tercera, and just to give you some context, La Tercera and El Mercurio are 2 outlets that are said to be close to the political right wing of the country. And Bachelet represents the center-left side of the political spectrum. So what happened here is that they were not trying to hold the government accountable or to be the watchdogs of democracy. They just wanted to expose the president because her political ideology did not align with the outlet's ideology. I also asked them about the official sources, and I realized that they have kind of an unhealthy relationship with the public officers, a quid pro quo kind of relationship, and they are open about it, and they know it. But there is no way around it. So they told me, sometimes political sources need you to write something about them, and you do it, even if it's not newsworthy, because you need to keep your relationship with them. I wouldn't say it's unethical, but it's certainly, and I'll give you this if you give me that kind of relationship. And this is a quote from a journalist from La Nación, which at that time was supposed to be a little closer to the left. And finally, I asked them about the unofficial sources. Let's remember that these are political reporters. And they told me that, yes, I mean, we quote them, but we don't necessarily work with them because we work with politicians and power groups. So in this case, I asked them also, like, do you use social media to find like alternative voices or alternative stories or alternative angles? And they told me, yes, we do use social media, but it's more as a system of awareness, as Alfred and Mida could say, but not necessarily to find new voices. So they are using the affordances of new technologies basically to do the same thing that they could do in offline context, to have the sources that they already know. So this is my last quote. The usual news reader is not my reader. Political analysts, political elites, political journalists, they read my stories. Maybe those readers interested in politics do so as well, but those are just a few. So they don't even see the normal reader as their reader, so there is this cycle where they write for their colleagues and for our powerful groups. So just to finish my presentation, I see Rosenthal is getting stressed out here. Some takeaways. The political angle had more to do with the Chilean media ideology and less to do with a definitive departure, a more mature approach from sensationalistic practices. Reporters focus on the political angle due to editorial prompting. The reliance on official sources is a burden on journalists, but even though the dictatorship days are long gone, we still depend on what the powerful group tell us, and we feel the pressure, but there is no way around it. And the nature of political reporting does not allow for unofficial sources to be quoted. So in summary, we see that the journalist-source relationship is profoundly symbiotic, and it's problematic and unhealthy, and we should be concerned about this. So I'll be happy to keep talking about this with you guys later on, maybe during the reception. Thank you so much for being a great audience.